Okay. We're live. Hello, everyone. Currently 0 people. Hello to you all. We have Ben Watkins, and we're going to be talking about my sparse areas of disagreement with Parfit. So I think the first, we could take these in whatever order we want, but perhaps the first thing that we could discuss would be the repugnant conclusion. First, to just lay out what the repugnant conclusion is. So the repugnant conclusion imagines a world that is with so it compares two states of the world. State of the world 1 has 7 billion people or so with excellent lives, and state of the world 2 has some vast number of people with lives barely worth living. And on views like the ones that I defend, views that say that we should maximize overall utility, they would say that the second state of the world could be better if there are a large enough number of people with lives. That seems unintuitive. So do you want to sort of lay out your view of like how you resist the repugnant conclusion, and then we can sort of talk about the considerations relating to that?
So I guess I have something of a confession of my own. I don't really have a solution to the repugnant conclusion. So it's one of those sort of problems that I've really struggled with, and I feel like I've spent more of my time trying to understand exactly what the repugnant conclusion is and why it's so forceful, why it's so hard to avoid. And really where I've come up on it is that it's an inconsistency. If you accept the logic of the repugnant conclusion, then it seems like there's a tension between at least 3 claims that we just don't want to give up. And if we were to give up one of these intuitions, that's what makes the conclusion repugnant. So the first intuition that I would want to say is that the addition of more lives worth living does not make things worse. So I feel like that's a pretty standard consequentialist / utilitarian intuition, because we want to say, that even Parfit would want to say here, everyone has reason to want more things worth living in the world, and that it doesn't make things work by adding things that we all have reason to care about to the world. We're not making things worse. I think we all want to say that. Another intuition is that increasing total and average happiness makes things better. So if we increase the total amount of people that are happy, we're going to make things better. And if we increase the amount of happiness, that even if we're not increasing the total number of people, but the average happiness in the world, we're making things better. And again, the logic of the repugnant conclusion seems to say that we might have to deny this intuition. And then the third intuition is that, fewer very happy people are better than more unhappy people. And so I want to say that, look, 1 billion, happy people is better than billions of unhappy people. I want to say that. And if the logic of the repugnant conclusion holds, it seems I might have to give up this intuition. And so we would be trading these for intuitions like the addition of more lives worth living does make things worse. And that seems repugnant. Increasing total and average happiness makes things worse. That seems repugnant. And more unhappy people are better than fewer very happy people. Again, that intuition, the intuitions that I'm going to have to give up at least one of these. There's a tension between, and so I'm going to have to embrace one of these 3 claims, and that just seems repugnant. And I actually don't know a way out of this. I accept the logic of the repugnant conclusion, and I want to hold all 3 of these claims. And so for those who are familiar with my work with Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast, I'm really big on the problem of evil. I think that it's a super interesting problem, and I can super relate now with a theist who's struggling with the problem of evil, who might think, look, there's got to be some solution to this problem. I may not know what the solution is, but there's got to be some solution to it. And I just don't know what that solution is.
Yeah, so I would agree with you that we have to throw out one of these views. And the view that I think is the most palatable to throw out is the view that we should reject the repugnant conclusion. One point that I think is just worth clarifying is that in the repugnant conclusion, which is the third thing that we're considering rejecting, the people that we're adding to the world, they have lives that are worth living, but just barely worth living. So it's not like their lives are net negative. Their
Well, you could
lives are
even
just
take it. I've seen this taken even further and to say that look, it's like the existence of billions and billions of oysters, things that are just barely conscious, if conscious at all.
right. Right. So yeah. So it's a question of whether if we compare small numbers of people with, or like some large number of people
Yes.
with lives that are very good to vast numbers of people with lives that are barely worth living. So and part of the reason why I would reject the third view is that I think that if we accept the third view, then there are lots of other independent plausible conclusions that we would have to throw out. So one of them is a principle that I call the leveling down principle, which I think I think I need to come up with a different name of it because I think that the leveling down principle is something else in philosophy. But so the principle is basically for people of utility n, for people of utility n, there are some number of people with utility of less than n, which brings about an overall better state of the world. So let's say that we're comparing a state of the. So if we're considering one person who has a utility of 1,000, then you can get an overall better state of the world with people with slightly lower utility. So let's say two people with utility of 900. Well, that seems intuitive. Then we compare each of those two people with utility 900 to, let's say, two people with utility 800. So now four people with utility 800 is preferable. And then we compare each of those to two people with 700. And so we can keep going down this path until we get some at each point finding the next point along the chain to be preferable, having far more people, until we get to some vast number of people with lives that are barely worth living. And so this principle seems very plausible. And so it seems like the intellectual price tag of accepting three would be not only that we would have to reject either one or two, but that we would also have to reject this fourth very plausible principle, the leveling down principle.
Yeah. So I guess really your solution isn't really a solution to resolve the tension. It's just to bite the bullet. It seems. It seems like we want to just say, yeah, look, it is the case that a world with more unhappy people in it is better than one with fewer exceptionally happy people. And so it should just kind of embrace the repugnant conclusion. And I'm not saying that's the wrong solution, because I guess it's kind of where I'm at, in the sense that I don't have a solution other than to just accept the repugnant conclusion and just say I don't like giving up any of these intuitions. Like, I want to say fewer very happy people is better than more unhappy people, but it seems like the repugnant conclusion has pushed me to have to say more unhappy people are better than fewer very happy people.
Right. I think that the repugnant conclusion. So I didn't actually find it to be like that repugnant to start out with. And then I think that there are lots of other plausible principles that we would have to reject in order to hold on to our conclusion, where we say that the repugnant conclusion is in fact repugnant. So another of them is Humer had his own paradox, where so he had three principles. The first one was the benign addition principle. So if worlds X and Y are so related that X would be the result of increasing the well-being of everyone in Y by some amount and adding some new people with worthwhile lives, then X is better than Y with respect to utility. That one seems obviously true. If we have a state of the world where we increase the well-being of existing people and then bring new people into existence with lives that are worth living, that seems obviously better. There are also non-anti-egalitarianism, which says that if X and Y have the same population, but X has a higher average utility, a higher total utility, and more equal distribution of utility than Y, then X is better than Y with respect to utility. And then the third one is transitivity. And transitivity seems very obviously true, that if A is better than B and B is better than C is better than A. That it follows from, if we accept all three of those, then we would have to accept the repugnant conclusion that some vast number of people with lives that are barely worth living would be overall more worthwhile than billions of people who have very, very good lives.
I think that's right. So who do you think has the best formulation of the repugnant conclusion other than Parfit? Have you read any articles in particular that you go, oh, wow, this makes the repugnant conclusion very clear? Because I felt that I obviously got the idea intuitively from Parfit in Reasons and Persons, but I haven't explored so much a lot of the literature that has been written about it. And I was wondering if you had any insights there.
Well, so I think that the paper that I find the most compelling in terms of talking about the repugnant conclusion is Humer's paper titled In Defense of Repugnance. I think that one's really interesting because Humer is an intuitionist.
And he's an amazing writer. Like his writing just kind of grips you.
Yeah, Humer is brilliant. Humer is so there are lots of very smart people who disagree with me about lots of things, and I think Humer is the in terms of all the authors who argue against utilitarianism, I'd say Humer is probably the one that I find the most compelling.
I would agree.
So I think that there are two papers that Humer's written maybe more, but two that just sort of I can think of off the top of my head that where he argued for things that accord with the utilitarian judgment about things. And in both of those were some of the most compelling papers I'd ever read. The second one was called A Paradox of Weak Deontology, I believe. And in that, so his basic argument was, so on non-consequentialist views, they would hold that if you could inflict 5 units of harm on one person to bring about 10 units of well-being for another person, you should not do so. Right, harming one person to benefit another person more is generally bad on non-consequentialist views. But so Humer has this principle, which is, okay, so if we hold that X is bad, that action A is bad, and action B is bad, even if A has already been done, then actions A and B are bad, which seems like a very plausible principle. If it's bad to do something and there's something else that it's bad to do, if it's bad to do the first thing, then it's bad to do both of those things. And so he says, okay, so let's imagine that there are two people, person A and person B, and we can inflict 5 units of pain on person A to give 10 units of well-being, or 10 units of pain reduction to person B. And then we can do the opposite for person B. So for person B, we can give them 5 units of pain 10 units of pain reduction by inflicting 5 units of pain on person A. And so deontological views, which hold that you shouldn't harm one person to benefit another person more, would have to hold that the conjunction of those actions would be morally bad, given that it's wrong to do the first one, and it's wrong to do the second one, even though it's wrong to do the first one. But then if that's true, then it's wrong to do an action that makes everyone better off, which seems very unintuitive. And he argued that the best way to reconcile these is consequentialism. He went into much more detail in that paper, but that paper I found extremely compelling.
These are great insights. I'm glad I asked this question.
Yeah, I think Humer is. I really enjoy Humer's writings about things. He's also remarkably funny in his writings.
Yeah. Yes.
I read Knowledge, Value, and Reality, and he ended it. So he was talking about animal ethics, and he ended it with so eating meat is seriously morally wrong. And so not only should you not eat meat, you should attempt to reduce the meat consumption of those around you. So you should like not go to restaurants if you're going with friends, to restaurants where meat is being served. You should try to make sure that things happen at a vegan restaurant, etc. And he said, now, am I saying that if you eat meat, then you're doing something terrible? Yes. Now you may be offended by this, and if so, you may be planning on stopping reading my book early, in outrage. Well, it's a good thing that you just finished it. And that was the last line.
Yeah.
In reality, which I quite enjoyed.
Yeah. And I think he's right. I think it's also at this point heavily overdetermined that eating meat is morally wrong, and it's certainly participation in factory farming is wrong. Not just even in the way they treat animals, which is certainly wrong. We just shouldn't treat animals like that. But also in that it's something like cows emit enough methane to contribute to climate change in ways that are, like very, very significant.
Right. Yeah. There's the environmental case against eating meat. There's also just the like antibiotic, the like disease-based case. Lots of diseases come from factory farms, and diseases which kill millions of people. 75% of antibiotics are used for factory farms. And antibiotic resistance is predicted to kill 10 million people a year by 2050. So yeah, it is extremely overdetermined that eating from factory farms is very, very bad. Not to sort of beat a dead horse, but a few other considerations that I think make it decisive that we should reject the third principle, the one where the one that Parfit referred to as the repugnant conclusion. So one of them is so I think that if the principle seems less unintuitive, and it actually seems pretty intuitive when we just reduce the numbers. And so if we say that a world with 7 billion people is less good, who have excellent lives, is less good than a world of, let's say, 10 quadrillion people with lives that are barely worth living, then it seems like we could just divide both sides by 7 billion or so. And then we would get a world with one person who has a life that's excellent. It would follow that a world where we have one person who has an excellent life would be better than a world where we have, let's say, thousands or tens of thousands of people with lives that are barely worth living. And in that case, when we just when we reduce the numbers in both cases, then it starts to seem a lot more intuitive that one person living a great life would be a worse state of the world than lots of people living lives that are just barely worth living. And so now we might hold that reducing the numbers in both cases does not have sort of a symmetric moral effect. So if you reduce the numbers, if you divide by like 7 billion in both cases, that doesn't have a symmetric moral effect. But I don't think that argument stands up to scrutiny. So like, let's imagine that in the original repugnant conclusion case, we have the 7 billion people. They all exist in caves where they're causally isolated from all of the other 7 billion people. And we compare that to there being, and so in each cave, we can choose whether there would be one person with an excellent life or let's say 10,000 people with lives that are barely worth living. Well, and let's say there are 7 billion caves. Well, the repugnant conclusion, the original version, is just saying that if we reject it, we would say that in each cave that's causally isolated, we would prefer that there would be that one person with an excellent life than the thousands of people with lives that are barely worth living. But if we just get rid of all the other caves, which don't seem to make any moral difference, given that they're causally isolated, and just say, okay, let's just imagine there's just one cave where we can either have one guy with an excellent life or thousands of people with lives that are barely worth living. It seems a lot more intuitive that we should have the thousands of people with lives that are barely worth living than the one person with the excellent life, which I think shows that lots of the anti-repugnant conclusion views are steeped in status quo bias about a roughly existing number of people, rather than in sort of principled considerations that we would want to affect our moral conclusions about things.
Awesome. So do we want to move on to another Parfit topic at this point?
Yeah, we could move on to another part.
Yeah, there's several directions we could go here. And so some of the things that I've obviously enjoyed discussing about Parfit are the nature of his meta-ethical views, the climbing the same mountain views and normative ethics. He's got interesting things to say in personal identity. And he's also got interesting things to say about what Henry Sidgwick called the dualism of practical reason. So what do you think? What direction do you think we should go?
Well, we could do the climbing the mountain thing.
Okay.
On that subject, I think that I largely agree with him, but not entirely. So I think that the best versions of all of the views would sort of converge to some degree, given that I think that
we should probably lay out what views that we're talking about,
yeah.
these views that are converging. So to give the audience some background here, Parfit thinks that the best forms of consequentialism, deontology, and contractualism all point to principles that are incompatible with each other and that might actually imply one another. In the metaphor he likes to use is that these principles are climbing the same mountain but from different sides. So they should all largely agree on what acts they condemn and what acts they permit. And so that the deep tension in ethics is not actually between deontology, contractualism, and consequentialism, but is actually between rational self-interest and impartial benevolence. And so that's what he called the dualism of practical reason. He thinks that it's harder to rule out something like ethical egoism than it is, and that's a really deep disagreement. Whereas the disagreements between deontology, consequentialism, and contractualism are relatively superficial.
Yeah, so I think that Parfit was... So two elements that I would disagree with Parfit about this. So one is that... So Parfit, sort of a notable omission from Parfit's triple theory was virtue ethics, which...
Yes.
And, reading the writings of the virtue ethicists, I mean, I say this as kindly as possible. It does not seem like they're climbing the same moral mount. Like, I don't know, virtue ethics just seems like to be...
Seems like it's asking different questions. So I think that the consequentialists, deontologists, and contractualists are asking a different question than the virtue ethicists. So the consequentialists, deontologists, and contractualists are asking the question, what should, ought, or must I do? So given any act, when I have a choice, which of these choices should I prefer? So it's individual choices. But it's not so clear that virtue ethicists are answering that question, because in fact they would answer that question of, well, whatever your virtuous character would choose in that situation. They're asking the question, how should I live? What sort of character should I have through time, such that my life on the whole is good? How do I live a good life? And I think that's just a fundamentally different way of approaching ethics, because it's one, Aristotelian, because it kind of, the question frames that there is this telos, there is this, what it is like, this ideal character that we can cultivate through practicing virtues. And so that the teleology is a whole life lived, whereas the teleology in consequentialism, deontology, and contractualism is to this state of what's good, the best act, what sort of acts people can all rationally will, and what acts would make things go impartially best, and what sort of principles no one could reasonably reject. And so it just has a different telos as the end goal of what morality is about.
Right. So I do agree that the virtue ethicists are sort of doing a different project. But I think that to the extent that, so Parfit had this triple theory largely in an attempt to show that contrary to what people who are persuaded by the argument from disagreement against moral realism, actually the best versions of the moral theories sort of converge. But to the extent that we think that the virtue ethicists are off doing their own thing on a different mountain, so to speak, then that seems to cut against the view that the best versions of all of them converge, because it seems like, to the extent that one of the most popular views in ethics, that's I think more popular than contractarianism, is just not answering the same, when they think of ethics, is not thinking of the same types of questions as the types that Parfit and contractarians, deontologists, etc., are thinking about. Then that seems to show that, well, it's not decisive, and it doesn't show that the project of reconciling ethics and sort of bringing the best versions of all the ethical views together is impossible. It does show that there are at least some people who, in their ethical projects, don't seem to be climbing the same mountain.
Yes. And I think you'd have to say something similar to someone who's like a Nietzschean about ethics, who sees, ethics as this product of, a spirit, like an Ubermensch, kind of through time, inventing himself and how he stands in relation to other people. And so it kind of this egoist / virtue ethicist type, like, I think he does have to say that these types of ethicists are also just on a different mountain.
Yeah.
Their ethical projects are just different.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And I think that this sort of makes it so that Parfit's project ultimately might be a little bit less successful than he would hope, but it certainly does not mean that the project of reconciling the best versions of the theories is useful or anything, is useless or anything close to that. I think that it still has quite significant normative implications. The one issue that I would have with the triple theory, well, so I think that the triple theory, so I would have an objection to it the way that Parfit formulates it, but I think that the best versions of all of them would actually be climbing the mountain towards act utilitarianism. And so I can.
This is super interesting. Yeah, I'd love to hear. So you prefer act consequentialism to rule consequentialism, and right. So that's your view is closer to classical utilitarians like Bentham and Mill and Sidgwick, and more modern utilitarians like Singer and Katerina. I can never say her name.
I think Delazari-Roddick, if I remember correctly.
Delazari-Roddick, that's it. I've met her in person too, and she's just absolutely wonderful. So I wish I was better at pronouncing her name.
So
go ahead.
Yeah, so first, for just sort of a preliminary note, so I think that something very similar to what Parfit was doing can be used to argue that people are climbing the mountain towards act utilitarianism. And so Parfit made the move of having his version of the theories be about the rules that are optimific, uniquely universally willable, and not immediately reasonably rejectable. But it seems like an equally viable move that you could make to the extent that you have reason to think that we have reason to think that act consequentialism is better than rule consequentialism, is it seems like another just perfectly plausible candidate for a triple theory that to which they're all converging would be act in ways that are optimistic, uniquely universally willable, and not immediately reasonably rejectable.
Yes. So Parfit agrees with those utilitarians who are trying to avoid implausible implications about their consequentialist views, the sorts of worries that stem from things like examples with surgeons, killing patients and harvesting their organs in order to save 5 people, or various implausible implications. I say, look, those acts themselves might be, what do the best, but in the long run, on the whole, principles that just allowed, or rules that just allowed that, for doctors to go kill perfectly healthy patients in their waiting room to harvest their organs to save 5 people. If a moral principle allowed that, there would just be chaos. And so that instead you would want to act on rules. Now, obviously there's problems with rule consequentialism in itself, because it seems like rule consequentialism just might collapse back into act consequentialism. There's a lot of interesting paradoxes that I think can count against rule consequentialism.
Right.
But Parfit sides with them to try to avoid those implausible implications of counterexamples to where maximizing utility seems like it would be the wrong thing. That act couldn't be what makes things go best.
Yeah, so I think that Parfit. So I would go basically the opposite way of Parfit for almost exactly the same reason. So I would agree that if you think that utilitarianism gets the wrong answer in a wide range of cases, like the organ harvesting case, then it would make sense to perhaps embrace some form of rule consequentialism. I think that there are some problems with rule consequentialism, but so what I think is that the answers that act utilitarianism gets in a lot of those cases seem wrong at first, but upon reflection we realize that either act utilitarianism doesn't really justify them, or they're not actually wrong. So to take the example of the organ harvesting case, so I think that act utilitarianism. So one thing that I think is often unappreciated is that one act that can be taken is adopting a rule and following it. So adopting the rule of not killing patients and following it is the type of thing that makes things go best. But I think that if we want to make a stronger claim that not only is it good to that not only is it good to adopt a rule that where a person follows the Hippocratic Oath, doesn't kill their patients, etc. But actually where even if we stipulate away all those constraints, so we say that we're asking about what an agent who is like, let's say, not a medical doctor, so is not sworn an oath, should do. We know with absolute certainty that no one will find out. And we stipulate all other constraints. I think that someone like Parfit would say that utilitarianism gets the wrong answer in that case. And I would actually say that utilitarianism gets the right answer in this case. I wrote an article about this where I argued for accepting the conclusion that you should kill people and harvest their organs. One argument for this is that rights, holding that we have sort of rights that shouldn't be violated in cases like this, it runs into a problem based on the aims of a benevolent third-party observer. So it seems like a benevolent third-party observer should hope that you do what's right. However, it also seems like a third-party observer should if given the choice between one person killing another to prevent 5 indiscriminate murders, choosing between that and 5 indiscriminate murders, or so this is just sort of criticizing the broader concept of rights. But so if a third party observer had a choice between one person killing another person to prevent 5 murders, or allowing 5 murders to happen, given that a murder to prevent 5 murders is surely no worse than just a regular murder, it seems like they should prefer the world where one person kills one person to prevent 5 murders to the world where the 5 murders happen. And so if we think that a benevolent third-party observer would prefer a world in which you kill one person to prevent 5 murders, and we think that a benevolent third-party observer should hope that you act that you don't act wrongly, then it seems like it would be wrong to act in a way where you don't kill the person to prevent the 5 other murders. And while that's not exactly like the Oregon case, I think that it has it would be sort of weird to accept that you should kill one person to prevent 5 murders, but not accept that you should kill one person to prevent 5 people from dying from organ failure, for example.
Gotcha. That's an interesting way of thinking about it. Because I've always kind of take the cheating way out, and to say that you just wait for one of the 5 patients to die and harvest their organs to save.
All right,
so
I know
I know I'm kind of cheating with that response.
Right, and there's a similar sort of there's a similar objection that I would have, that so we generally think.
Can I guess and say that you push the fat man?
Yes, I think that you should push the fat man off the bridge.
Go ahead. I'm
sorry. Actually, I think it's, this response is monumentally arrogant. But that's only if we stipulate that there will be no legal or reputational consequences, because I actually think that this may sound a little bit arrogant, but I plan on donating enough money over the course of my life to save more than 5 lives. So me going to jail would not save the most lives overall. But if we stipulate that there are no legal consequences or anything, then I think you should push the person off the bridge to prevent the 5 deaths. So there's another objection that I think would be given to rights. And this applies more directly to the Oregon case. So we would generally think that it matters more to not violate rights than it does to prevent other rights violations. So we intuitively think that you shouldn't kill one innocent person to prevent 2 murders. But presumably preventing a murder is not morally any more relevant than preventing one other death. And so this seems intuitive, right? A doctor should not try any harder to save a person's life on the basis of them being shot than on the basis of them having a disease not caused by malevolent actors. However, there seem like, so if we hold both of those principles, there seem like counterexamples to this, which would make it so that we would want to sort of give up this notion of rights. So suppose that we have people in a circle where they each have 2 guns that will shoot the person next to them. They have the ability to either prevent 2 other people from being shot with another person's gun, or to prevent one of their own guns from shooting one person. If we hold the view that it's more important to prevent yourself from to not violate rights than it is to prevent 2 other rights violations, then it seems like it would be right for every person in the circle to prevent one of their guns from going off, rather than to prevent 2 strangers' guns from going off. But if we accept that that's what everyone should do, well, then everyone in the circle would end up getting shot, rather than no one getting shot. And so if we modify the case where it seems like you're making the choice of whether to prevent yourself from taking an action that would violate rights, or to prevent 2 other people from taking an action that would violate rights, then the distinction starts to seem quite a bit murkier.
Yeah. Oh man, this has been a great discussion so far. Do we want to say something on Parfit's meta-ethics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we both agree with Parfit's meta-ethics almost
Yeah.
entirely, and for very
Yeah.
similar reasons. Yeah, I mean, I
So
find that... Sorry, good.
you would put yourself in what's known in the literature, which Parfit doesn't actually endorse this label, but I'm sure he recognizes it, the term ethical non-naturalist. So this idea that reasoned relations and more particularly moral reasons are irreducible. They can't be restated in non-normative terms, nor if they are true, could they state non-normative facts. They're irreducible.
So I would though. So I would agree with all of those things. I would also use the moral non-naturalist label, but I would be slightly hesitant to use it on the basis that I think that lots of talk about whether or not we're moral naturalists or non-naturalists is somewhat confused and results in there being a seeming divide when there isn't actually. So I recently had a conversation with James Fodor. We talked a lot about meta-ethics, and at the end of it, we were basically in agreement about what we thought about meta-ethics. We just were in disagreement about whether that would be considered naturalism or non-naturalism. And so if you think that moral facts are just necessarily supervenient facts about well-being and suffering, so that much like to describe, so like there are certain natural things that you would have to describe in order to give an adequate account of well-being and suffering. So like you would have to just say that they're mental states, and describe other things about them. And one of the things that you would have to describe about them in order to give an adequate account of what suffering is like, when I say well-being, I meant pleasure, but what pleasure is like. One of the things that you would have to say about it to give an adequate account of it is that it's good, that it's better that it is experienced, and for suffering that it's bad that it's experienced. And so, and there's no deeper account. Like when we say it's good, we don't just mean that it's desired or something. We mean that it's irreducibly normatively good. That
we
was
all
sort of
have reasons to want, reasons to care about it for its own sake, and
right.
just for that reason.
Yeah, so I think that there are lots of people who are moral naturalists who I think I have more in common with than many of the moral non-naturalists. So I agree with Parfit's meta-ethics. I think that, but I do think that the terminology can get somewhat confusing, such that when I'm labeling my
he makes it even more complicated by calling it cognitivist non-realism.
Yeah,
and I'm like, no, that's even worse.
Generally conceived of as realism. Yeah. Yeah, I found the whole cognitivism. There are some of Parfit's meta-ethics that I found a little bit confusing. So when Parfit says that moral truths are true, but not because they correspond to reality, like that they're as true as any truths can be, but there's no part of reality to which they correspond. I don't know, that I think, I find a lot of the disputes between Platonists and nominalists to just be relatively confusing and hard to understand what the heck they're talking about.
That's his position too, is that the questions that nominalists and Platonists ask and worry over just aren't clear enough to be confident that they even have answers. And so his whole point is like, look, when I'm talking about the truth of a moral principle, I'm not talking about any ontologically weighty feature of reality. I don't have to add nor subtract things from my ontology in order to have these truths. And so
right.
Wolfram Sellers divides this up into what he calls the logical space of reasons and the realm of law. And so like our causal intuitions are described within the realm of law, the realm of natural law, causation, how things are in the world, whereas how things ought to be or should be or must be or what we have reason to do or believe is described within the logical space of reasons. And this is clearly David Hume's famous is ought distinction. He's just saying that, like, look, there are facts in the logical space of reasons that are true in the in similar mathematical truths, logical truths, modal truths, non-normative or non-moral normative truths, like what we should believe. These are all described in logical space of reasons. And what makes truths true in the logical space of reasons isn't something from the law, from the realm of law. It's not that you have to add things to our ontology in order for those truths in the logical space of reasons to be true.
Yeah, I feel like I feel like I sort of have trouble. Yeah, I mean, what Parfit says sounds plausible, though I feel like it just becomes sort of like somewhat unclear as to what is being discussed at that point. But
Yeah.
I think that much of Parfit's view is to just sort of dissolve the question of what is being discussed and to just say what we're discussing, that there's no Platonic realm of moral facts that sits out there that could be any other way. There's just, these aren't true.
Yeah, he says that he doesn't have to make any claims about realm, non-spatial temporal entities in another realm. He says I don't have to make any claims like that in order for basic moral truths to be true. No more than mathematicians have to worry about if there isn't some Platonic realm of numbers, that all of their mathematical theories would be false because there just aren't these entities to correspond to their mathematical claims. So all of their mathematical theories are false. Mathematicians just don't worry about those sorts of things because it's what's given rise to the problem is the intuition that I think it stems from the plausibility of the correspondence theory of truth. This idea that look, things are made true by how they correspond to some feature in reality. It's true that the cat is on the mat if there is, ontologically speaking, a cat with the relation on another ontological entity, the mat. And so if you try to extend that correspondence theory to logical space of reasons, that's where I think you get this whole muddied, messed up into, you start looking for these theories of forms or these tropes like God's will or commands, or these things that are weird to try to quote unquote ground these basic moral truths. Whereas someone like Parfit or other anti-reductionists or non-naturalists in meta-ethics would say, these sorts of things don't need any further grounding. The whole idea of there needing to be some further grounding is where the mistake is being made.
Yeah. One objection. Sorry, this is going back a little bit to the triple theory, but I remembered something that I forgot to mention on that again. So one objection that I saw to the triple theory that I thought was pretty persuasive. So Parfit says that we should act in accordance with rules that are optimistic, uniquely universally willable, and not immediately reasonably rejectable. So there's a counterexample that was given by someone. I think his first name was Gideon. I'm forgetting the name of and a different version was given by Richard Yetter-Chapel. So the counterexample is, so let's suppose that there is an evil demon that would torture everyone horrendously, unless everyone holds the belief that it's good to kick cats when you see them. So if everyone, the rule that hold the view that it's permissible to kick cats whenever you see them, that rule is optimistic, uniquely universally willable, and not immediately reasonably rejectable. If that rule wasn't universally willed, then everyone would be brutally tortured. But note, that rule doesn't make, so the evil demon will only torture people, will only torture people if people don't believe that it's good to torture cats. But there's no extra moral benefit to actually torturing a cat. But it seems like on Parfit's view, he would have to hold that even though torturing a cat produces no moral benefit, the only benefit comes from holding the rule that there's nothing wrong with torturing a cat. That even though there's no benefit from torturing a cat, it's still morally good to torture cats in that world, despite there being no benefits to it, which seems like a pretty compelling counterexample. I'm not sure, was my explanation the case clear? If not, I can.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting objection, because it's saying that look, Parfit's triple theory here has the seeming implausible implication, and that it might seem like a wild, scenario, but even Parfit himself would agree that, look, this is a genuine puzzle, and if our moral theories are going to be plausible, then they must give the right moral answers, even in imagined scenarios, so that there must be some way to resolve this, to say that, hey, maybe the right thing to do is to just say, yeah, in that case, you would have to bite the bullet and say that, you would have to torture cats, and that would be one of the principles that would be universally willable, would make things go impartially best, and would be a principle that no one could reasonably reject, but we just don't have to worry about that sort of situation. That situation would never actually arise. Or he might take a route and say, look, well, it implies that this being that we're talking about, this maximally like, what seems so bad about it is that there's this malevolent being that isn't themselves acting in ways that would be disallowed by for that being who was doing this to the world. It would not be rational. It would, they could not rationally will that act. They would just be this maximally supreme being who was acting wrong in the universe, and so we would just be merely puppets of, we ourselves were being tortured because we have to torture cats because there's this supreme being who's acting maximally malevolently to the whole world.
Right.
So we aren't actually at moral fault here. The moral fault is with this being, this immoral being that's, imposing these restrictions on the world, and that his triple theory does condemn those actions.
Right. So I agree that his triple theory would, of course, condemn the action of the evil being. But so the triple theory is not just supposed to have plausible results in worlds where everyone acted according to the triple theory. So the triple theory is supposed to have plausible results, given that in this world, not everyone acts according to the triple theory. And yet Parfit wouldn't hold that means that the triple theory doesn't apply in this world. So the triple theory is just describes the rules that should be followed, are the ones that are
the rules that would make things go impartially best.
Right. And so the fact that the demon is not following those rules doesn't harbor an implication in terms of mitigating the force of the objection for how we should act. And in terms of the other thing,
because the being will torture us, though, if we don't follow these rules.
Right. So right. just to be clear, the case. So in the case that we've stipulated, it's not that torturing cats has any benefit. It has no benefit. The only thing that has benefit is believing that it's morally okay to torture cats, or that it's morally good to torture cats.
But because if you don't, then the world gets tortured maximally.
Right. And so I'm saying that Parfit's view has the implausible implication that you should torture cats, even though torturing cats does not it doesn't make anything go best. The only thing that's good is having the belief.
Well, yeah, it does. It makes things go best by the world not being tortured maximal.
Well, no, so it's not that. Well, it's not the torturing of cats that does that. It's only the belief that you should torture cats that does that.
Yep.
So I agree that I agree that so any plausible moral implication would say that on this view, we all ought to have the belief that we should torture cats. because otherwise everyone would be tortured. But then the question is, given that the only thing that matters is having the belief that we should torture cats, does that mean that we should actually all? It seems like that gives us that this case gives us a reason to believe that we should torture cats, but it doesn't seem like this gives us any reason to think that we actually should torture cats, given that there's literally no benefit to torturing cats. The only benefit comes from holding the belief that we should torture cats.
Well, and so there's another objection lingering here to the idea that ought implies can. So it can't be the case that we ought to change our beliefs unless we can change our beliefs. And so that some form of doxastic voluntarism must be true, but doxastic voluntarism is false. We can't just choose what we believe. You couldn't hold a gun to my head and say, believe 2 + 2 = 5. I just couldn't believe that 2 + 2 = 5, given a base 10 number system. It's just something that I could not do. So it might just be the case that I cannot come to believe that torturing cats is good, or that I should torture cats. That's just not, it can't be the case that I ought to believe that, if it's not also the case that I could, in a hypothetical motivational sense, will that I believe that I should torture cats.
Sure. I think that this also sort of leads way to a different but closely related objection. So consider the first case where the demon will torture everyone unless everyone holds the view that we should torture cats. However, some people don't hold the view that we should torture cats, and so the demon tortures everyone. And so then the question is that in that world where the demon's already torturing everyone, should you torture cats? It seems like the answer is no. Torturing cats, it would be good for everyone to will the maxim, all torture cats. But given that not everyone is acting on that maxim, it seems like in the world as it is, where it's not the case that everyone is acting on that maxim, like you shouldn't torture cats, given that you have no reason to torture a cat. The torture done by the demon will happen either way, given that there are some people who will not believe that you should torture a cat, or who will not act in accordance with the maxim torture cats.
Gotcha.
And so, and it seems like the best way of reconciling these is to take the act utilitarian route, which is amenable to saying that adopting rules is an act. So adopting and following rules is an act that you can take. And so adopting the rule, don't violate people's rights, might be an act that brings about the best outcomes. And so that allows us to get what we want out of Parfit's view, which is where we avoid sort of the narrow-minded consequentialist, where you take an action that may bring about good consequences in a very limited sense, but where where being the type of person who does that brings about bad consequences. So it allows us to accommodate that intuition without having implausible implications in cases like the ones that I described, where there's value to to acting on a maxim, but to adopting a maxim, but there's no value to acting on the maxim once it's adopted.
Gotcha. So we're at about an hour. Do we want to kind of bring things to a close, or were there any other topics that we wanted to cover before we do that?
One other topic that might be interesting. So I know that Parfit held a view had a theory of well-being I'm a hedonist. So I think that the only thing that determines how well people's lives go is how much happiness they have over the course of their life. Happiness and minus suffering.
Yes.
So, and so Parfit's view was that what matters. So I read Parfit's view originally, and I found it a little bit confusing, because what Parfit seemed to say is that what matters is the parity between something being producing happiness, being desired, and being part of the objective list. But there's Parfit wants to say that
hedonism is part of the truth, but it's not the whole truth. So the hedonist wants to say that happiness and suffering exhaust the objective list. So we both agree that he's not the desire satisfaction theory. He's not saying that, what determines, whether life goes best is whether you fulfill a maximum number of desires. He wants to say that there's an objective list of things that are good, things like friendship, knowledge, truth. These are things that are objectively valuable, but are not plausibly accounted for by pleasure and pain. So the very popular counterexample here is Nozick's pleasure machine. This idea, or you could go into this machine and be maximally happy. However, it seems like you still wouldn't want to get in the pleasure machine because you'd want, that world would be an illusion, wouldn't be a true world. And so that there's something other than happiness that's value, namely truth. And so I think Parfit, maybe he wouldn't agree with that particular argument, but he would argue with those who sympathize that there's this objective list of things that make life worth living in a moral sense that go beyond just happiness minus suffering.
Yeah, so in terms of, so we can start off with the experience machine objection. So I think the experience machine is an interesting objection, though I found Singer and de Lazari-Rodek's responses to be pretty compelling, which is that it seems like the unwillingness to enter the experience machine is steeped in status quo bias. So Philippe de Brigard, what he did, he wanted to test whether the cause of this was status quo bias. So he asked lots of people to imagine that they were currently in the experience machine, and then to ask them whether they would want to be unplugged and brought into the real world. And most people said no. And so that seems to show that it's just status quo bias. It's just it's not a preference for the real as much as it is a preference for remaining, for continuing to live the life that you're currently living. And the other weird thing is that, so in Brigard's experiment, so he asked people to imagine that their real life was very good. And then he asked a different set of people to imagine that their real life was medium. And then he asked a third set of people to imagine that their real life was pretty crappy. And the people who were asked to imagine that they had the medium life, if I remember correctly, more of them were in favor of unplugging. And so that doesn't seem rational at all. So it just seems like this whole, like, some of our intuitions about the experience machine are a bit irrational and are rooted in status quo bias.
Gotcha.
I would have. So you were saying something about, so you're a hedonist. So you were disagreeing with putting other things. So Parfit holds this objective list view. You just want to say, look, the only things on that list are happiness and suffering. And the only thing that matters for the well-being of our lives is the happiness minus the suffering.
Right. Yeah. And I think there are a few reasons to prove that. One of them is just in terms of simplicity, that it requires positing fewer things. And it seems like objective list theory is sort of less parsimonious, which counts against it. So that would be one consideration. And I also think that there are some interesting counterexamples to objective list theory. In terms of the experience machine, what would you say to the status quo bias objection to the experience machine objection?
So I think it's an interesting objection. First off, I probably would sympathize with that objection. I think that really the where I come down is kind of a hard line stance against the experience machine, and that I think you just should get in the experience machine. that a machine that can cause you to be happy, even though it's not true, is still worth getting in. And so that I just kind of bite the bullet. I mean, and say that no, like there might be a lot of people that initially don't want to do that. And so this is kind of the fundamental driving intuition in the matrix. The matrix, should they stay plugged into the matrix or not? And then, infamously, the character Cypher, he wants to go back in. He betrays his friends, Neo and the rest, because he wants to go back in. And I think there's actually something rational about Cypher's decision there. Now, obviously, he's portrayed as the bad guy in that movie, and that what he was doing was wrong, and that it did matter whether or not they were in reality. They would, better to be free and suffering than to be a slave and happy. A slave,
Yes.
who loved their chains. And I actually think it's not implausible for someone like Cypher, in the sense that what he was doing was rational. He wanted the better life. And a machine that could, give you a happy life, and that you would not be able to qualitatively tell the difference, which we're already in. Like, we can't prove that we're not in a matrix. And so it would be functionally indistinguishable from the well-being we would live in the actual world. But the difference would be that you would be happy. You would be more happy than you are now. And that's the only consideration that really matters.
Yeah,
And that's
I agree
kind
with
of a
that.
hard line. That's kind of a hard line take on it. I get that, but that's just kind of where my thinking is these days.
Yeah, I very much agree with you about that. Wait, so just to be clear, do you agree with Parfit on objective list theory, or are you a hedonist?
Yeah, so I am an objective list. So I agree with him in that hedonism is at least part of the truth. I'm not convinced that it's the whole truth, because I also think there are other things that are valuable, in that things like art and things like friendship and things like knowledge, and that these sorts of things matter for their own sake. Freedom would be another one. It seems like these things are valuable, that we should care about these things for their own sake. Now, I realize that the natural response is that, look, these things are only good insofar as they bring you happiness. But I'm not entirely convinced about that. I mean, I think that the people who fought for freedom, what they did was good, even though their lives ended up being worse for it. The world is full of people and so I think we'd have to say that those people were in a way acting irrational, because they didn't bring about what was best for them. But I think they did act morally, in the sense that it makes things go impartially best, because freedom is something that's valuable for all of us. And so I'm very sympathetic to that line of thought. I think that has a lot of power for me. But that's not to say that, I'm not going to change my mind one day and just see the light and be like, hedonism.
Yeah, so in terms of the view that that these things are valuable, even if that they're valuable independent of hedonic value. So you gave the example of like art and beauty. Did you say beauty, or did I mishear?
Yeah, so that would go in with art. So I think that I am an objectivist about beauty, and I realize that that's a controversial position in and of itself. But part of the reason why I'm an objectivist is because I think that beauty has value in itself. I think that there is value in something like music. I think that, something like Chopin or Bach are things of infinite value that are in a way, priceless, that are valuable just for having existence in the world, and that the world is better because it has them in it.
Oh, okay. So let's imagine. So would you say that that if there's a, let's say there's so more, so Sidgwick gave the sort of the objection that, like, for things like beauty, beauty only seems valuable if it's observed, and Moore gave the response that no, that doesn't really seem correct. If there was a universe that had no sentient beings, that was just a
Yeah,
pile of filth,
I
that
sympathize with
seemed,
Moore's argument, yes, more than I
yeah.
did Sedgwick's.
So I would have an objection to Moore's argument, which is, so if Moore's argument is true, that seems to have some strange implications. So if we hold that that one instance of, sorry, that a beautiful unobserved universe has value, well, then it seems like infinite beautiful unobserved universes would have infinite value. And some arbitrarily large number of unobserved universes could have some arbitrarily large amount of value. And yet that seems to have some weird implications. So one of those implications would be, suppose that you had two options. Option one, so you could press a button that would do one of two things. The first thing that it would do is it would bring into existence, let's say, Googleplex galaxies that will never be observed by anyone, but they're beautiful galaxies. And option two is you could cure malaria. It seems like if you hold that a beautiful unobserved galaxy has value, then creating Googleplex of them would just have such a vast amount of value that it would dwarf nearly all other considerations. And yet it seems very unintuitive to say that bringing into existence Googleplex unobserved galaxies is more morally important than um, than than like ending malaria. It seems like the worst atrocities in history that are significantly worse than if we destroyed quadrillions of galaxies that no one will ever observe, even if they're beautiful.
Yeah. And so I would also think that that's also has to do with the kind of paradoxes of adding infinity to the mix. So infinity is super counterintuitive and super complex mathematical concept. And so when we talk about beauty being of infinite value, I think we are going to get implications that seem weird, and that's just, again, I think I kind of bite the bullet on this and be like, yeah, those implications are weird, and it's because infinity is weird. And so when you have an infinite number of valuable things, it does dwarf the finite world where malaria isn't cured. So yeah, I think it's a good objection.
Wait, so sorry, when you say music is infinitely valuable, I mean,
I might have misspoken. I wanted to say intrinsically valuable.
oh, okay,
I mean,
yeah,
I might have
that,
been in philosophy of religion mode, and talking, God being infinite, and yeah, I think what I meant to say was intrinsically valuable.
sure. I suppose you could bite the bullet. I don't know. That does seem like quite a bullet to bite. That,
Oh, for sure.
like,
I'm having to bite a lot of bullets. It feels like I'm probably going to have to bite the repugnant conclusion bullet.
yeah. I mean, this one seems a lot more intuitive than the repugnant conclusion. So, or a lot less intuitive than the repugnant conclusion. So, like, so one implication of this seems to be that, suppose that we found out that the universe is not infinite. Well, if you hold that an infinite universe, even if there was no life throughout most of it, would have infinite value as a result of being infinite in size. And then it seems like the ultimate problem of evil would just be the problem of, or I guess it wouldn't have to be evil. It could just be like absence of good. But the ultimate problem of absence of good, so to speak, would just be, why aren't there infinite unobserved universes? And yet, I don't know.
So there might.
Seems like,
so that isn't that the multiverse hypothesis? So I mean, that's going to be infinite number of universes. I mean, there's an infinite number of worlds just like ours, and an infinite number of worlds much different than ours. Yeah, I think that's what happens. Like when we throw in the concept of infinity into these thought experiments, yeah, I think that's when things are going to start getting weird.
Yeah, so I think that I think that there's a version of your view that the bullet that you're biting seems like quite a bullet to bite, and I think that there's a version of your view that's defended by people like Richard Yetter-Chapel, who's an objective list theorist, that I think allows you to maintain some of the attractive features of objective list theory, but that allows you to sort of dispense with this very counterintuitive implication. So what they would hold is that the things on the objective list, what matters is appreciation of the things that are on the objective list, and so beauty is not valuable if it's unobserved, but beauty gets extra value from being unobserved. Beauty has no value, but if you observe beauty and appreciate the beauty, that has value that's greater than just the value of having an ice cream sundae, even if the experience of eating the ice cream sundae was more pleasurable. And so that seems like that I still would have some objection to that view, but that I would find that view to be a more attractive view than the one that you're currently defending, because it seems like that view avoids having the unintuitive implications like the ones that I described about it being more important to create Googleplex unobserved galaxies than to end malaria, for example.
Gotcha. All right, we're at an hour and 15 minutes. This might be a good place to wrap things up. This has been an awesome conversation. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, thanks.
Meeting a fellow moral realist who enjoys Parfit. This was just a treat.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I saw your debate with Trent Horn, and I knew you were a Parfit fan from the when the question about objective morality got brought up, and he asked you about it, and you said that you thought that all the main theories were climbing the mountain on three sides. That was a giveaway that you're a fellow Parfit fan.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. All right, and thanks for watching, everyone. Well, yeah, okay. Right.